under the relentless Oklahoma sun. John Harlan stood 6 feet deep in the hole he'd been digging for hours, his calloused hands gripping a shovel worn smooth by years of labor. At 55, his broad shoulders still carried the strength of a younger man, but his eyes held the weight of a life that had long since lost its shine. The red dirt of his isolated ranch, 20 miles from the nearest town, clung to his sweat-soaked shirt as he worked. The wooden cross he'd carved leaned against a nearby rock, its inscription stark and final. Here lies a man who lost everything. No name, no need for one. By sundown, John planned to be beneath that dirt, forgotten by a world that had already taken his wife, his son, and any reason to keep breathing. The air was thick with the heat of late August, the kind that made the horizon shimmer and the ground crack. John's ranch, a crumbling relic of better days, sprawled across 100 acres of scrubland, bordered by a dry creek bed and a scattering of mesquite trees. He'd lived here alone for 5 years, ever since the fever took his family and left him a husk of a man. The nearest neighbor was a half-day's ride, and the town of Redding population 800. Most of whom knew John as the hermit who never spoke was too far for anyone to stumble across him. By chance, that was how he wanted it. No witnesses, no questions, just silence. As he drove the shovel into the earth for what felt like the 1000th time, a shadow flickered at the edge of the grave. Then another, and another. John froze, his breath catching in his throat. 5 small figures stood at the rim of the hole, their silhouettes sharp against the blazing sky. Girls, by the look of their tattered dresses and tangled hair. The tallest couldn't have been older than 15, the smallest barely 6. Their presence was so impossible it felt like a fever dream. John hadn't seen another soul on this land in years, let alone children. The desert around his ranch was a death sentence for anyone without a horse or supplies. Yet here they were, staring down at him with eyes that held secrets too heavy for their years. "Who are you?" John rasped, his voice rough from disuse. He leaned on the shovel, squinting up at them, half convinced they were ghosts conjured by his guilt-ridden mind. The tallest girl stepped forward, her posture rigid but her voice steady. "We need your help, mister." Her name, he'd later learn, was Sarah Miller. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and a streak of dried blood marked her arm. The smallest girl clung to her side, clutching a stuffed bear missing one button eye. The others stood close, their faces bruised and dirt-streaked, their eyes darting nervously across the empty landscape. John's grip tightened on the shovel. "How'd you get here? Ain't no way kids walk 20 miles through that desert." "We did," Sarah said simply. 3 days. No water after the first." Her words were matter of fact, but the exhaustion in her voice told a story of survival that made John's chest ache. He noticed the cuts on the second oldest girl's hands, the way the youngest trembled despite the heat. These weren't lost children. They were running from something. "I don't have time for this," John said, turning back to his digging. "This is private land. I'm busy." He didn't want to care. Caring had cost him everything once before, and he was done with it. The grave was his future, and he wasn't about to let 5 strangers pull him back from it. Sarah's eyes flicked to the cross, then back to him. "You're digging your own grave, aren't you?" Her bluntness caught him off guard, and for a moment, he couldn't meet her gaze. "We don't have anywhere else to go. They'll kill us if they find us." The word kill hit John like a slap. These were children, not outlaws. But the fear in Sarah's voice was real, the kind that came from staring into the face of true evil. He studied them more closely now. Bruises marked the arms of the second youngest, a girl of about 8. The third girl, maybe 12, had a cut above her eye that looked fresh. The smallest one's bear was stained with something dark blood, maybe. John's stomach twisted. "Who's trying to kill you?" he asked, though every instinct screamed at him to stay out of it. "The men from the children's home," Sarah whispered. "They think we saw something we shouldn't have." John's blood ran cold. He'd heard whispers about the Redding Children's Home, a grim institution on the edge of town run by a man named Victor Grayson. Rumors of missing children, of money changing hands for reasons no one dared speak aloud. The kind of place where hope went to die. The smallest girl, clutching her bear, let out a soft sob, and Sarah knelt beside her, murmuring words of comfort with a tenderness that belied her age. It was the kind of gesture John hadn't seen since his wife was alive, and it cracked something inside him he'd thought long dead. That's when he saw a dust cloud on the horizon, moving fast toward the ranch. Sarah saw it too, her face paling. "They found us," she breathed. John's eyes darted between the approaching riders and the 5 terrified girls, standing beside his half-dug grave. Every fiber of his being told him to send them away, to climb back into that hole and finish what he'd started. But Sarah's eyes fierce, desperate, reminding him of his sons the day he'd promised to protect him forever held him in place. The hoof beats grew louder, a drum roll of impending violence. John had a choice to make, one he never thought he'd face again: die as planned or fight for something worth living for. "Get inside the house," he barked, scrambling out of the grave. "Now." Sarah hesitated, her hand tightening on the smallest girl's shoulder. "You don't understand. They have papers, legal papers. If they find us here, they'll take us back, and you'll be arrested for kidnapping." The word kidnapping hit John like a punch. He wasn't just looking at scared kids anymore. He was staring at a legal trap that could destroy what little he had left. "Then why come here?" he demanded, his voice rough with frustration. "Because you're the only one for miles who isn't in their pocket," Sarah said, her voice trembling but resolute. "The sheriff, the mayor, the judge and I are all paid by Mr. Grayson. Grayson. Victor Grayson." The name was a curse in these parts. A man who owned half the county's businesses and had his hands in every dirty deal, from land grabs to bootlegging. The hoof beats were close now, close enough that John could count them 5 riders, moving with purpose. He glanced at the girls, then at the grave he'd been digging. The life he'd planned to end was no longer an option. "What's your name?" he asked Sarah, his voice low and urgent. "Sarah Miller," she said. "These are my sisters Clara, Ellen, Jane, and Lily." Her voice cracked on the last name. The smallest girl, who looked up at him with eyes too big for her face. "All right," John said, his decision settling over him like a heavy coat. "Here's what we're doing." He grabbed the shovel and started filling in the grave, his movements quick but deliberate. "Sarah, take your sisters to the storm cellar out back. There's a trap door under the old hay bales. Stay quiet, no matter what you hear." "What about you?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm going to convince them you were never here," John said, though he knew it wouldn't be that simple. Men like Grayson's didn't give up easily, and if Sarah was right about their connections, they had the law on their side. The girls vanished behind the house just as the riders crested the rise, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that glowed red in the fading light. John kept shoveling, playing the part of a man with nothing to hide. The lead rider, a man with a deputy's badge glinting on his chest, pulled up 20 feet away. His name was Samuel Holt, a man John had seen in town, always with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon," Holt called, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "We're looking for some runaway girls. 5 of them, ages 6 to 15, escaped from the Grayson Children's Home 3 days ago." John didn't look up, just kept filling the hole. "Haven't seen any girls. Don't get visitors out here." Holt's smile tightened. "They're dangerous, Harlan. Witnesses to a crime. We've got a warrant to search any property within 60 miles. Dangerous?" John stopped shoveling and met Holt's gaze. 5 little girls? That's a hell of a stretch, deputy. One of Holt's men, a weary man with a scar across his cheek, spoke up. "They saw something they shouldn't have." He shut his mouth quick when Holt shot him a look, but the words hung in the air. John's mind raced, connecting the dots. These weren't lawmen looking for runaways. They were enforcers sent to silence witnesses. "Search if you want," John said, leaning on his shovel, "but make it quick. I've got work to do." Holt nodded to his men, who dismounted and spread out, checking every corner of the property with the precision of hunters. John kept shoveling, each scoop of dirt a reminder of the life he was burying that just his own. But the man he'd been, the one who'd given up, the weight of it pressed on him, heavier than the earth in his hands. He was committing to something he'd sworn never to do again: care. One of the men emerged from behind the house, shaking his head. Holt's jaw clenched, his patience wearing thin. "Big place for one man," he observed. "Must get lonely." "I like lonely," John replied, his voice flat. Most folks cooperate with the law, Holt said, his tone hardening. Those who don't tend to find themselves in trouble. John's hand drifted toward the revolver at his hip, an old habit from his days as a deputy himself. Before grief had driven him to this wasteland. That a threat, Holt? Just stating facts, the deputy said. Those girls stole property from the children's home. Anyone hiding them would be an accessory. Another lie. John saw the game now. These men weren't after justice. They were covering up something ugly. The searchers finished their sweep, reporting back with nothing but frustration. Holt's eyes lingered on the partially filled grave. What were you burying? Dead livestock? Old dog, John lied smoothly. Died last night. Funny place to bury a dog, Holt said, his eyes narrowing. Right by the house. Funny thing to question a man on his own land, John shot back. The tension was a live wire, ready to spark. Holt's hand hovered near his gun, and John's muscles tensed. Ready for a fight he didn't want, but wouldn't back down from. But then Holt reconsidered, perhaps sensing the danger in a man with nothing to lose. We'll be back, he said, gathering his reins. Those girls can't hide forever. They rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a promise of trouble. John waited until they were out of sight, then headed for the storm cellar. The girls were huddled in the dark, their faces pale in the dim light filtering through the trapdoor. Sarah's arms were wrapped around Lily, who was shaking silently. Are they gone? Sarah asked. For now, John said. But they'll be back with more men. We should leave, Sarah said, her voice heavy with guilt. We've put you in danger. John looked at their frightened faces, thought of Holt's threats, of the legal noose tightening around him. He thought of the grave he'd been digging just hours ago. Then he thought of his son, who'd looked at him with the same trust these girls now showed. No, he said firmly. You're staying. That decision changed everything. Men like Holt didn't stop the escalated. And as night fell, John knew the storm was coming. As darkness settled over the ranch, John found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, cooking for others. The girls sat around his battered kitchen table, their faces scrubbed clean, but their eyes still haunted. Sarah kept glancing at the windows, her body tense as if expecting an attack at any moment. John set plates of cornbread and beans before them, the simple meal a stark contrast to the danger closing in. Tell me what you saw, he said quietly, sitting across from Sarah. She shook her head. The less you know, the safer you are. I'm already in this, John said. Those men will be back, and I need to know what I'm fighting. Lily, the youngest, looked up from her plate, her voice small but clear. We saw Mr. Grayson hurt a lady. Lily, no, Sarah hissed, but the girl pressed on. She was yelling, and then she stopped, Lily said, her eyes wide with a truth too big for her years. John's blood turned to ice. Where did this happen? He asked, his voice careful. In the basement of the children's home, Sarah said, barely audible. We were supposed to be asleep, but Lily had a nightmare. We went to get water and heard her screaming. Clara, about 10, added, the lady was asking about missing kids. She had papers, said she was going to tell everyone what Grayson was doing. A whistleblower, John realized. Maybe a journalist, maybe someone from the state. Someone who'd gotten too close to Grayson's secrets. Why do they want you back? He asked. Because we're the only ones who saw, Sarah said. If we're gone, there's no one to tell. The pieces were falling into place, and John didn't like the picture they formed. These girls weren't just runaways, they were witnesses to a murder, maybe more. And Grayson, with his money and influence, would stop at nothing to silence them. There's something else, Sarah said, reaching into her dress. She pulled out a small, worn notebook, its pages creased and stained. The lady gave me this before they got her. She said it had to get to someone who could stop him. John took the notebook, his hands unsteady. The first page was a ledger, names, dates, payments, a record of Grayson's operation. Not just the children's home, but a network of trafficking that stretched across Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas. Children sold to factories, to mines, to places John couldn't bear to think about. Some entries were marked special orders, with sums that made his stomach churn. This wasn't just evidence of murder, it was proof of an empire built on the suffering of the innocent. They know you have this? John asked. Sarah nodded. They tore her room apart looking for it. That's when we ran. A new sound cut through the night hoofbeats, too many to count. John moved to the window and saw torches flickering in the distance. At least 15 riders approaching fast. This wasn't a search party anymore. It was a war party. They brought an army, John said grimly. Sarah was already gathering her sisters, her movements sharp with fear. We have to go now. John shook his head. Too late. They've got us surrounded. He moved to his gun cabinet, pulling out a rifle, a shotgun, and his old service revolver. The girls watched, wide-eyed, as he loaded each weapon with practiced ease. What are you doing? Sarah asked. What I should have done years ago, John said. Standing up. Outside, a voice boomed through a megaphone. Harlan, we know they're in there. Send them out, and this ends easy. Easy. As if there was anything easy about handing children to monsters. John looked at the girls, at the notebook in Sarah's hands, at the life he'd been ready to end. Get to the back bedroom, he told them. Hide the notebook under the floorboards. Whatever happens, don't come out until morning. Sarah grabbed his arm. Why are you doing this, mister? Harlan? John thought of his son, of the promises he'd failed to keep. Because some things are worth dying for, he said. The first torch hit the roof, and the world erupted into chaos. John kicked out the front window, taking aim at the nearest rider as flames licked the shingles above. His first shot dropped the man from his horse, the crack of the rifle echoing like a thunderclap. The response was immediate. Bullets tore through the house, splittering wood and shattering glass. John rolled away from the window, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning timber. Harlan, Holt's voice cut through the gunfire. You're harboring criminals. You're a dead man unless you surrender. John answered with another shot, catching a shadow moving toward the house. The man's scream was swallowed by the roar of the fire. From the back room, he heard coughing. Girls were trapped, the smoke growing thicker by the second. Grayson's men didn't need to storm the house. They just needed to wait for the flames to drive everyone out. Sarah, John shouted. Can you get the back window open? It's stuck, she called back, her voice strained. John cursed, grabbing a lantern and smashing it against the front wall. The oil caught fire, spreading flames across the porch. If they wanted fire, he'd give them a blaze to remember. The light exposed 3 gunmen creeping toward the house, and John's rifle dropped 2 before they could find cover. But the fire was spreading too fast, the roof groaning under the weight of the flames. Here I am, John roared, stepping onto the porch with his shotgun. Come get me. The gunfire that followed nearly tore him apart. Bullets chewed up the porch, one clipping his arm and sending a jolt of pain through him. He dove behind a barrel, returning fire with both barrels, dropping to more men. But then he heard Lily scream, high and terrified, coming from behind the house. They've got us, Sarah shouted. John's heart sank. The girls had been caught. He peered through the smoke and saw them tied to a wagon, Holt standing over them with a gun to Sarah's head. Come out, Harlan, or they die. John's ammunition was low. 5 bullets in the rifle, 3 in the revolver. Not enough to fight through a dozen men, but maybe enough for one last play. The notebook, hidden under the floorboards, was the key. If it survived, Grayson's empire could fall. If not, this was all for nothing. He crawled back into the burning house, the heat searing his skin. The floorboard in the back bedroom was hot to the touch, but he pried it up, grabbing the notebook and tucking it into his jacket. Footsteps echoed on the porch. Holt's men were coming inside. John grabbed a can of blasting powder from the pantry, a remnant from his days clearing land. He poured a trail across the kitchen, leading to a pile near the stove. Lighting a match, he tossed it onto the powder and dove through a window just as the explosion rocked the house. The blast tore out the back wall, sending wood and flame into the night. 2 of Holt's men were knocked down, and the others stumbled, disoriented. John saw the girls, tied to the wagon 50 yards away, surrounded by 6 men. Sarah's dress was torn, her face bruised. The sight ignited a rage in John that burned hotter than the fire behind him. He charged, rifle blazing, dropping to men before they could react. A bullet grazed his side, but he kept moving, fighting with a ferocity he hadn't felt since the war. Holt screamed orders, pressing his gun harder against Sarah's temple. Drop it, Harlan, or she's dead. John froze, his rifle halfway to his shoulder. Sarah's eyes met his, mouthing one word, run. But John was done running. He pulled a hidden derringer from his boot and fired, the bullet catching Holt in the chest. The deputy's gun went off, the shot going wild as he fell. The girls fought back, Sarah untying her sisters, Clara and Ellen kicking at their captors. Even Lily bit a man's hand, her small teeth drawing blood. But then John saw more riders, at least 20, coming from the direction of Reading. Victor Grayson himself, come to finish what his men had started. John Harlan's chest heaved as he crouched behind the overturned wagon. The journal pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat. The air was thick with smoke from the burning ranch house, its flames casting an eerie glow across the Oklahoma desert. The hoofbeats of Victor Grayson's approaching riders 20 strong, maybe more, thundered closer, a relentless drumbeat of doom. Sarah Miller, the 15-year-old leader of the 5 orphan sisters, gripped a scavenged rifle, her bruised face set with determination. Her sisters Clara, Ellen, Jane, and little Lily huddled beside her, their eyes wide with terror but flickering with a stubborn hope that John's actions had kindled. He'd just killed Deputy Samuel Holt with a derringer shot, buying the girls a moment of chaos. But the cost was steep. His ammunition was nearly gone, his body was battered, and Grayson himself was coming to end this. John's left arm hung useless, blood seeping from a bullet wound in his shoulder. His side ached where another shot had grazed him, and his vision blurred from smoke and exhaustion. But the sight of Sarah, fighting to protect her sisters despite the fresh bruises on her face, fueled a rage in him that drowned out the pain. These men had hurt her, a child, and that violation ignited something primal in John, a man who'd spent 5 years burying his own grief. The girls weren't just witnesses to a murder, they were the key to dismantling Grayson's empire of cruelty. And the notebook in John's jacket was the proof. He had to get them out of here, get that notebook to someone who could bring Grayson down, even if it cost him everything. Sarah, John whispered, his voice rough as gravel, can you get the girls to the canyon? There's a trail about a mile north, leads to a ravine where you can hide. Sarah's eyes flicked to the approaching dust cloud, then back to him. What about you? You can't fight them all. I don't need to fight them all, John said, checking his revolver, 3 bullets left. I just need to slow them down. Lily, the 6-year-old clutching her one-eyed bear, grabbed his sleeve. Don't leave us, mister. John, she whispered, her voice trembling but fierce. The trust in her eyes hit him like a bullet, reminding him of his son, Tommy, who'd looked at him the same way before the fever took him. John swallowed hard, pushing the memory down. He couldn't afford to break now. I'm not leaving you, little one, he said, ruffling her hair. But you need to move. Now. Sarah nodded, her jaw tight. She gathered her sisters, whispering quick instructions. Clara, 12, helped Ellen, 10, to her feet, while Jane, 8, held Lily's hand. They moved toward the canyon, keeping low to avoid the flickering torchlight. John watched them go, his heart pounding. The girls were his reason to fight, but the notebook was the weapon that could win the war. He tucked it deeper into his jacket, praying it would survive the night. The riders were close now, their torches painting the desert red. John positioned himself behind the wagon, using the burning house as a backdrop to silhouette his targets. He had maybe 20 bullets total, his rifle, the revolver, and a handful scavenged from Holt's body. Against 20 men, it was a death sentence, but John knew this land better than they did. Every gully, every rock, every shadow was a map etched in his mind from years of solitary wandering. He'd make them pay for every step they took. Harlan, a new voice boomed, rich and commanding, cutting through the crackle of flames. Victor Grayson himself, astride a black stallion that gleamed in the firelight. He wore a tailored suit, absurdly out of place in the desert, and his face was all hard lines and cold eyes. You're harboring fugitives. Hand over the girls, and I'll let you walk away. John's laugh was bitter, swallowed by the wind. You mean hand over the kids you're trying to kill? Not likely, Grayson. Grayson's smile was a predator's, all teeth and no warmth. Those girls are thieves, Harlan. They stole from my institution. You're aiding criminals. Criminals, John shouted back, his rifle trained on a rider creeping to the left. They saw you murder someone, Grayson. That's why you're here." The accusation hung in the air, and for a split second, Grayson's composure faltered. His men fanned out, professional killers in duster coats, their movements precise and disciplined. These weren't Holt's sloppy hired guns. These were men who'd fought and killed for money, and they knew their trade. John's first shot caught the nearest one in the chest, dropping him before he could flank the wagon. The return fire was immediate, bullets tearing into the wood around him, splinters flying like shrapnel. John rolled to a new position, a pile of rocks that offered scant cover but a better angle. $25,000 for his head, Grayson roared, his voice cracking with fury as John proved harder to kill than expected. The promise of money made the men reckless, and John used it against them. His next shot took out a rider trying to circle behind, the man's horse rearing as he fell. The chaos gave John a moment to reload, but the fire from the house was spreading to the barn, the flames licking at the dry wood and creating a wall of heat that made breathing a chore. "Burn him out," Grayson ordered. His men lit new torches, tossing them at the outbuildings. The chicken coop caught fire, then the shed where John stored his tools. Soon, the entire ranch would be an inferno, and John would have nowhere to hide. He glanced toward the canyon, where the girls had disappeared into the shadows. He had to buy them time, but the odds were slipping away faster than the sand beneath his feet. Then he heard it gunfire from the canyon, sharp and desperate. His heart sank. The girls had been found. Grayson's men must have anticipated their escape route, set a trap in the ravine. John's mind raced. He couldn't stay here, pinned down by Grayson's army, while the girls fought for their lives. But charging into the open was suicide. He needed a diversion, something to break the enemy's focus. He grabbed a stick of dynamite from the wreckage of the house, a leftover from clearing stumps years ago. Lighting the fuse, he hurled it toward a cluster of riders, the explosion sending horses rearing and men diving for cover. The blast bought him seconds, enough to sprint toward the canyon, keeping low to avoid the gunfire that followed. Bullets kicked up dirt around him, one grazing his thigh, but he kept moving, driven by a purpose he hadn't felt since before his family died. As he reached the canyon's edge, he saw the girls pinned down behind an overturned wagon, its wheel spinning uselessly in the torchlight. Sarah was firing a rifle with a precision that would have made any soldier proud, but she was down to her last few shots. Clara and Ellen shielded Jane and Lily behind a boulder, their small bodies trembling but defiant. 6 men advanced on them, moving with the coordination of a trained unit. This wasn't a random ambush. Grayson had planned every move, herding the girls into a trap. John took aim, dropping one of the canyon gunmen with a shot to the back. The others turned, their gunfire forcing him behind a rock. He was caught in a crossfire now, Grayson's main force closing in from behind and the canyon gunmen ahead. His ammunition was dwindling, 10 bullets left, maybe less. But surrender wasn't an option. Surrender meant handing the girls to monsters, and John Harlan was done letting monsters win. "Behind you," Sarah shouted, and John dove as a bullet from Grayson's men whizzed past his ear. He returned fire, wounding another rider, but the numbers were overwhelming. Then he saw something that stopped his heart. Lily, breaking free from her sisters, running toward him with her bear clutched tight, tears streaming down her face as bullets kicked up dust around her. "Mr. John," she cried, her voice a desperate plea. "Help us." The sight of that 6-year-old running through gunfire snapped something inside him. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. He threw himself into the open, taking a bullet meant for Lily in his side as he scooped her up and rolled behind a rock. Pain exploded through him, blood soaking his shirt, but he held her close, shielding her with his body. "It's okay, little one," he whispered, though his strength was fading fast. "I've got you." Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. "They're coming. More men." She was right. Grayson's reinforcements were pouring into the canyon, their torches like a swarm of angry fireflies. John's vision blurred, his body screaming for rest, but he couldn't stop. The notebook was still in his jacket, the girls were still alive, and somewhere out there, justice was still possible. He handed Lily to Clara, who'd crawled to his position. "Keep her safe," he said, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. He turned to Sarah, who was reloading her rifle with shaking hands. "You've got to get to the ravine. There's a cave about a half-mile in. Hide there with the notebook." "What about you?" Sarah asked, her eyes fierce despite the fear. "I'm going to make sure they don't follow," John said, forcing a smile that felt like a lie. He had maybe 5 bullets left, a body that was falling apart, and 20 men closing in. But he'd faced worse odds in the war, and back then, he'd been fighting for ideals. Now, he was fighting for family. As the girls scrambled toward the ravine, John positioned himself behind the boulder, his rifle trained on the advancing gunmen. Grayson's voice echoed again, closer now, dripping with venom. "You're a dead man, Harlan. Give up the girls, and I'll make it quick." John's answer was a bullet that caught one of Grayson's men in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. The return fire was relentless, chewing up the rock around him, but John kept shooting, each shot a defiance of the fate he'd planned that morning. He was no longer the man digging his own grave. He was a man fighting for redemption. But redemption came at a cost. A bullet tore through his leg, dropping him to one knee. Another grazed his scalp, blood streaming into his eyes. He was running out of time, out of bullets, out of everything. And then he heard a sound that changed the game. Bugle calls, sharp and clear, coming from the east. The U.S. cavalry riding hard toward the gunfire. Grayson had made a mistake. His attack was too loud, too brazen, drawing attention he couldn't buy off. But the cavalry was still minutes away, and the girls were still in danger. John saw Grayson himself now, dismounted at the canyon's edge, a rifle in his hands and murder in his eyes. The notebook was the key, the evidence that could destroy him. John had 1 bullet left in his rifle, one chance to end this. He raised the weapon, his hands shaking, his vision swimming with blood and smoke. Grayson's figure was a silhouette against the firelight, a perfect target. "Mr. John," Lily's voice broke his focus, small and desperate. "Are we safe?" That question, from a child who'd seen too much, shifted something in John. This wasn't about killing Grayson anymore. It was about giving these girls a future. Instead of firing at Grayson, he aimed at a pile of loose rocks above the canyon gunmen. The shot triggered a small landslide, burying 2 men and scattering the others in a cloud of dust. It bought the girls a moment to reach the ravine, Sarah clutching the notebook like a lifeline. "Cavalry's coming," Sarah shouted, her voice carrying hope for the first time. "I see their dust." Grayson's scream of rage echoed off the canyon walls. "Kill them all. No witnesses." But his men were breaking, the bugle calls sowing panic. Federal troops meant questions, investigations, things Grayson's money couldn't control. One by one, his hired guns slipped into the shadows, abandoning their boss. Only Grayson and 4 loyal killers remained, trapped in a canyon that was closing in like a noose. John crawled to a new position, his body screaming with pain. He had no bullets left in the rifle, only 2 in the revolver. Grayson's men were regrouping, their gunfire pinning the girls in the ravine. John saw Sarah take a grazing shot to the arm, her face contorting, but her grip on the notebook unwavering. He had to act, had to give them one last chance. Using the last of his strength, he lit another stick of dynamite and hurled it toward Grayson's position. The explosion rocked the canyon, sending rocks and debris flying. 2 of Grayson's men went down, and the others scattered, giving Sarah and her sisters a chance to reach the cave. John collapsed against a rock, his breath coming in ragged gasps, blood pooling beneath him. He'd done all he could. The rest was up to the girls and the cavalry. As the bugle calls grew louder, John's eyes locked on Grayson, who was now alone, his men deserting him. The businessman's face was a mask of fury, his rifle trained on the ravine where the girls had disappeared. John's revolver felt heavy in his hand, the 2 remaining bullets a final promise. He raised it, his vision fading, and fired. The shot caught Grayson in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. The canyon fell silent for a moment, the only sound the approaching hoofbeats of the cavalry. John slumped back, the revolver slipping from his hand. He'd done it. The girls were safe, the notebook was safe, and Grayson was finished. But as darkness crept into his vision, he wondered if he'd live long enough to see the justice he'd fought for. The cavalry stormed into the canyon, blue uniforms and flashing sabers a blur in the firelight. Captain William Tate, a grizzled veteran with a face like weathered leather, dismounted and surveyed the carnage. "What in God's name happened here?" he demanded. Sarah emerged from the cave, the notebook clutched to her chest. Her voice was steady as she told the story of murder at the children's home, the evidence they'd witnessed, the night-long battle to survive. She handed Tate the notebook, and his face darkened as he read the first few pages. "This is bigger than Grayson," he said, his voice grim. "This goes all the way to the governor's office." John, barely conscious, felt a small hand slip into his. Lily, her bear still clutched tight, looked up at him. "Are you going to die, mister?" "John." He managed a weak smile, his voice a whisper. "Not today, little one." But the fight wasn't over. Grayson's body lay still, but his network was vast, and the notebook's secrets would make powerful enemies. John knew the road ahead would be long and dangerous, but for the first time in 5 years, he had a reason to walk it. The Oklahoma dawn broke over the canyon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, a stark contrast to the blood and ash that stained the ground. John Harlan lay propped against a boulder, his chest bandaged by the cavalry medic, his body a map of once bullet grazes, burns, and a deep gash in his leg that throbbed with every heartbeat. The notebook, now in Captain William Tate's hands, was a ticking bomb, its pages detailing Victor Grayson's trafficking empire, implicating men in suits as polished as they were corrupt. The 5 Miller sisters Sarah, Clara, Ellen, Jane, and Lily stood nearby, their faces smudged with soot, but their spirits unbroken. Sarah, the eldest, held the group together, her eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting more trouble. Lily clung to John's side, her one-eyed bear pressed against her chest, her small hand still in his. The cavalry had rounded up Grayson's surviving men, 3 battered gunmen who'd thrown down their weapons at the sight of federal troops. Grayson's body lay covered by a blanket, his empire crumbling with every page Captain Tate turned in the notebook. But John knew it wasn't over. Men like Grayson didn't build networks alone. They had allies, powerful ones, who'd fight to keep their secrets buried. The girls were safe for now, but the notebook made them targets, and John's role as their protector was far from done. Tate approached, his face grim but resolute. "This evidence," he said, holding up the notebook. "It's enough to bring down half the territory's elite. Names, dates, payments. Grayson was running children through mines, factories, worse. Some of these special orders." He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "We'll get this to the territorial capital, but it won't be easy. There'll be men who'd rather see this burned than read." Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite the bandage on her arm. "That's why they wanted us dead. We're the only ones who saw what he did." "Not anymore," Tate said. "You've got the U.S. Army behind you now, and him." He nodded toward John, who managed a weak nod in return. John's strength was fading, the medic's bandages doing little to stop the bleeding from the bullet in his side. But Lily's hand in his kept him anchored, her trust a lifeline stronger than any medicine. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "We take the girls to Fort Gibson," Tate said. "They'll be safe there while we sort this out. You're coming to Harlan. You need a doctor, and we need your testimony." John shook his head. "I'm not leaving them." Sarah knelt beside him, her eyes fierce. "You've done enough, mister. Harlan, you saved us." "No," John said, his voice firm despite the pain. "You saved me 5 years ago." He'd lost everything: his wife, his son, his will to live. He'd come to this ranch to die, but these girls had given him a reason to fight, to be the man he'd failed to be when his own family needed him. The cavalry prepared to move out, loading the girls onto a wagon and securing Grayson's men for transport. John insisted on riding, though every step of the horse sent pain shooting through him. The notebook was tucked into Tate's saddlebag, guarded by 2 soldiers who rode close. The journey to Fort Gibson was 40 miles, a hard day's ride through rough country, and John knew Grayson's allies wouldn't let it go smoothly. They were right to be cautious. Halfway to the fort, as the sun climbed high, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. Tate raised a hand, halting the column. "Riders," he said, squinting through his field glasses. 10, maybe 12. Moving fast. John's heart sank. He recognized the tactics' flank movements, riders spreading out to cut off escape routes. These weren't bandits, they were Grayson's cleanup crew, men sent to destroy the evidence and anyone who carried it. Tate's men, 20 strong, were disciplined, but a fight in open country was a gamble, especially with the girls in the middle. "Get the wagon to that ridge," Tate ordered, pointing to a rocky outcrop a quarter-mile away. "We'll hold them here." John dismounted, ignoring the medic's protests, and took a rifle from a fallen soldier's kit. His wounds screamed, but he couldn't sit this out. The girls were his responsibility now, and he'd die before letting anyone touch them. Sarah, riding in the wagon, caught his eye. "Be careful," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made her sound far older than 15. The riders attacked with precision, their gunfire a storm of lead that forced Tate's men to take cover behind rocks and scrub. John positioned himself on the ridge, using the high ground to pick off 2 of the attackers before they could close the distance. The cavalry fought back hard, their sabers flashing as they met the enemy in close quarters. But Grayson's men were relentless, driven by the promise of money or fear of what failure would mean. John saw one rider break through, heading straight for the wagon. Sarah fired her scavenged pistol, missing but slowing the man enough for John to take him down with a shot to the chest. The effort cost him, his vision swimming as blood seeped through his bandages. He collapsed against a rock, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Mister!" John, Lily's cry cut through the chaos. She'd climbed out of the wagon, running toward him despite Sarah's shouts. A rider spotted her, raising his rifle. John didn't think through himself in front of her, taking another bullet in his shoulder as he pulled her to safety. The pain was a white-hot knife, but he held her close, her small body trembling against his. "Stay down," he gasped, shoving her behind a boulder. He turned just in time to see Tate's men gain the upper hand, their numbers and training overwhelming Grayson's hired guns. The last of the attackers fled into the desert, leaving 6 of their own dead on the ground. Tate approached, his face streaked with dust and blood. "You're a stubborn bastard, Harlan," he said, not unkindly. "Most men would be dead by now." "Got a reason to stay alive," John replied, nodding toward the girls. The rest of the journey to Fort Gibson was tense but uneventful, the cavalry on high alert for another ambush. At the fort, the girls were given clean clothes and a safe place to sleep, while John was carried to the infirmary. The doctor worked quickly, stitching wounds and muttering about miracles. John drifted in and out of consciousness, images of his son blending with Lily's face, Sarah's courage, and the notebook that held the key to justice. When he woke, 2 days later, the fort was buzzing with activity. Federal marshals had arrived, summoned by Tate's telegraph. The notebook had been copied, its contents sent to a newspaper editor in the territorial capital who couldn't be bought. The story broke like wildfire, Grayson's name splashed across headlines, his allies scrambling to distance themselves. Arrests follow at sheriffs, judges, even a state senator, all named in the notebook's damning pages. Sarah visited John in the infirmary, the girls trailing behind her. Lily climbed onto his bed, careful not to jostle his bandages, and handed him her bear. "For you," she said solemnly, "so you don't get scared." John chuckled, wincing at the pain. "I'm not scared, little one. Not anymore." 6 months later, John stood on the porch of his rebuilt ranch, the scars of that night hidden beneath fresh paint and new timber. The girls lived with him now, their adoption papers signed by a judge who'd survived the purge of Grayson's network. Sarah, now 16, had taken charge of the household, organizing chores with a general's precision. Clara and Ellen attended the new school in Reading, their laughter a sound John hadn't heard in years. Jane was learning to ride, her confidence growing with every day. And Lily still called him Mr. John, her bear now mended with careful stitches, a symbol of the family they'd become. The children's home had been shut down, its buildings repurposed as a real orphanage, run by people who cared. Grayson's empire was gone, his allies either in prison or hiding. The notebook had done its work, and the girls' testimony had sealed the case. John's wounds had healed, though the scars would always remind him of the night he'd chosen to live. As the sun set over the Oklahoma plains, painting the sky with colors of hope, John watched the girls play in the yard. Sarah caught his eye, offering a small smile that said more than words ever could. He'd been a man ready to die, digging his own grave in a world that had forgotten him. But these 5 girls, appearing out of nowhere, had given him something better than death: purpose. Some men are forged in fire, others shaped by loss. But a rare few find their strength in standing between innocence and evil, no matter the cost. John Harlan had found his calling in 5 orphan girls who needed him as much as he needed them. And in their courage, he'd found redemption. What would you have done in John's place? Would you have fought against impossible odds to protect the innocent? Or would you have walked away from a fight that wasn't yours? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And let's discuss the hard choices we face when confronting violence and injustice in our world. Your voice matters to us where you stand.